Wonderful. If you heard my computer read out it's recording in progress, I can only apologize. But hello, I'm Ed Stevenson. I'm here today to talk about something very exciting, which is building full stack serverless applications. Now, as a full disclaimer, and I do have a disclaimer later on, I do work for a company called Netlify. Now, Netlify does lots of wonderful things in serverless space. First half of this presentation is going to be very focused on kind of the abstract concepts. The second half, we're going to look a bit of kind of like what that real world implementation looks like from a kind of more architecture perspective. But I am going to be talking a lot about Netlify later on, but it's very much in the context of we do serverless things. We believe in serverless to a huge degree, and this is why and the justifications of it behind it. So I can only apologize for my rampant sales talk should be coming. I'm joking. I'm not that good at sales. But you have been pre-warned, so I can only apologize. So I'm very excited to get started. And a huge thanks to all of you coming on today. For me, it's 11 o'clock at night. So, I don't understand how I'm this awake, but we'll run with it. It's all good. So me, Ed, hi. I lead the integrations team from a technical side of things. I'm not good enough to be an engineering manager. I lead the technical side of the integrations at Netlify. This is a very, very exciting new kind of area, which, we've only kind of kickstarted in the past 12 months. And it's been a fantastic environment for me to really dive into, a company that promotes a lot of what I really enjoy about kind of this tech space. And it's, that focus on kind of a good core developer experience. So, from a kind of experience background on my end, I've worked in enterprise. I've worked for a big English car manufacturer, which makes cat-based cars, if you know what I'm talking about. I've worked in small businesses, and I've worked in fairly kind of late-stage startups as well. I've seen it all when it comes to kind of the modern tech stack and what people get up to. It's a truly wild west of implementation that you can see, but I'm here to teach kind of the good way and the good way. So I've done a lot of stuff in Kubernetes. Now, for someone who is such a big fan of serverless and such a focus on serverless, I think it's very important to kind of have seen the other side, so to speak. As we're going to get into and probably discuss later on in more detail, there is no one silver bullet for everything that comes to building in not just the web, but in the modern kind of technological world. You can have advocates for doing everything through, big kind of Kubernetes clusters. You can have advocates doing everything on serverless and, nothing in between. One of the most important things to remember is that everything is always nuanced, but ultimately, it's the best tool for the job that is going to win out. And that's up to you to decide as an engineer, developer, coder, hacker, whatever you'd like to refer to yourself as. It's on you to put your tools to chain, and it's on you to be able to justify to make yourself, your teammates, your colleagues, your friends, your peers, whatever. It's on you to really push for that. So despite all of that, I'm a huge fan of serverless, and I'm very, very excited to talk about a lot of things. So before I dig into the content, I hope to stick this to about 25 minutes and leave enough time for any questions. I do have a tendency to waffle and ramble and talk quickly. So if I can get at least 2 of those 3 under control, we should be onto good for that timings. But if not, I'll rush through it, and then people can ask me questions on any form of capacity that is available to them. So this is a talk about building full stack serverless applications. What does full stack mean? What is the full stack? So we need to start thinking about end-to-end development. Full stack is truly that under the hood. It doesn't mean using the same technologies or using the kind of the same processes. Full stack is just that you are concerned from everything from the client that your user is using to the back end and databases and services that power everything that your business logic or your custom dating app or ordering platform uses, whatever. Full stack is every single concern that is under the sun. And it doesn't mean you're using the same language, but you can. I've seen many applications where they've decided to use the same front-end technology, something like TypeScript, and apply that on the back end. That has so many advantages and, some disadvantages if you want to talk to me about those. But, it ultimately is a freedom of choice to do what you want. And the full stack is just having the appreciation for all of it. And ultimately, it covers everything. It is the entire developer surface that you're going to be interacting with. I've iterated the same point 3 times, but it is really, really key to understand. We are talking about everything here. So it's a lot of fun, and it's a good topic to get into. I have had someone tell me that full stack developers don't exist, which I'll happily fight anyone over. So if you feel like starting that fight today, I'm ready. Don't you worry. What is serverless from that perspective? So it is a really, really, really weird, modern-ish, inverted quotes, but it is a really weird phrase that you see thrown out a huge amount. But ultimately, it's an abstraction over servers. Servers are still involved, right? There is still something under the hood running somewhere in US East 1, US East 2, US West 1, if you're feeling funky. But it is ultimately something that's going to be running somewhere on a physical server. But for you as a developer, it's a general focus on making it someone else's problem. Now, that is a very, very flippant comment to make, but it is a very, very, very important tool for doing things very, very quickly, but ultimately getting away with being able to leverage a huge global platform that someone else has already built without you having to do the heavy work underneath to actually kind of build that. When you're looking at something of the scale of AWS or Azure or GCP, there is no way you're going to be able to build a data center affordably in every single kind of country that your user is going to be running in, on every single kind of, all of the regions and the latency backups and all of these things that you need to be able to kind of, deliver a product reliably. You can't deliver that single-handedly. Now, that doesn't, make it exclusive to a serverless thing, but it's part of that mentality of abstracting away something and making it someone else's problem. And that's really, really important to remember when it comes to the kind of wider process of serverless, methodologies. It is focusing on your domain, what you can control and what you should control ultimately. You could go out there and build all of your infrastructure if you wanted to. There are wonderful tools like Terraform if you want to kind of have a really slick infrastructure as code pipeline where you don't have to necessarily worry about the manual creating servers, deleting servers, all of that. But it allows you to, have a really nice experience for having all of your automated servers. But it only goes so far. There is only so much that you, as kind of any kind of scale of team, have the capacity to manage and own and kind of, responsibly own as well. It's not just a case of spinning up a server and keeping it up there and whatever. It's a case of looking after it day to day, having all of the observability set up, knowing what to do when it falls over. With serverless, you make it someone else's problem. Now, I said earlier, it's a bit of a weird term. There are so many kind of nuanced takes on what it could be these days. Scale to zero, usage-based, all of these different kind of terms get thrown around. It's very, very hard to kind of really nail down what serverless is under the hood. So there is a wonderful tweet I saw yesterday, and I thought it was perfect, really. And you can see it's from yesterday because it's made sense. So proof is in the pudding. I reached out to Adam to ask if I could reference this and I talked today, and he was really fun with it. But I thought it was a really, really kind of good summary of what serverless actually means kind of in 2023, not just kind of a tech term from, 2018, all those years ago. God. So it's a mindset that you'll do as little undifferentiated work as possible, devoting as much of your time and energy towards a thing that makes your product unique. Some still use it as a label for tools and services that adhere to some common set of criteria, scale to zero, usage-based billing, as we said in a previous slide. But it's a spectrum at best and an overused marketing term at worst. And I think that is kind of like what's core to the serverless mentality. Like, sure, mentality, it sounds like a cult, I do apologize, but it is kind of that idea of you are focusing on your code, you're focusing on your product, you're focusing on stuff that you should control and that is unique to you. Why not just offload the complex stuff to someone else? Now, yes, for our reasons like money and stuff, but we can get into that in a bit. But in this age of, such available technology and, compute's cheap, memory's cheap, space is cheap, especially when you're only using it for your application when a request is going on, it makes sense to just focus on your thing. And that's what I really like about kind of the server space, is that it makes it easy to do things that I find fun. Now, I do find building infrastructure fun, but I find building products a lot more fun, and that's what I like to do in my free time. Anyway, enough about me. How do you actually spot this in the world? Because it's such a term you get thrown around everywhere. Databases, they exist. Serverless databases are a thing. Now, databases need servers. Databases are always running. If there's something about databases compared to something like AWS Lambdas, with kind of functions, these functions as a service platforms, databases always have to be running. That's a kind of inherent part of what they are under the hood, is all of that kind of fast, rapid indexing and the processing that you need to do to be able to do stuff quickly and at scale. You can't have kind of stuff that is idle and then cold starts to the boot up and, all of this stuff. Databases need to be always available. So that's not strictly serverless because they do run on servers, but when you're as a developer consuming it, you're paying per read and write. That is kind of your unit of consumption. For APIs, something like I mentioned, AWS Lambdas or Netlify functions or any of these kind of functions as a service platforms, you're paying per request or the time of a request, combination of both, combination of bandwidth as well. Again, you're not paying for kind of the server resources or, your dedicated server in, Luxembourg or whatever. You're paying for a unit which is appropriate to what you are actually abstracting. And front ends paying for bandwidth. Again, it's this unit which is kind of common. And if we have a look, the read write, the request time, the bandwidth, you are charging based on the abstraction. And that is a really, really kind of good way that you can kind of see that the technology you're using is going to be serverless, not necessarily in its implementation, what goes on under the hood, but in the mentality that kind of goes on around it, into how you should approach it, how you should consider it as, kind of a vendor, as a platform that you should use internally. If they're doing that, then that's a consideration that they're going to be thinking that they want to be seen as something serverless, and they're going to want to be seen along the peers where they have the fantastic tooling, they have the fantastic reputations. And yeah, it's not just a buzzword. It is a really interesting sign into kind of the ways that companies and businesses are charging themselves. But hey, I think that's another talk. Okay, cool. So we understand what full stack is. We understand what serverless is. At least I hope you do. If you don't, I haven't done a very, very good job. But hey, we've got to kind of, collate all of these things that mean things, but like, okay, what does that mean? Not just individually, but ultimately as a company, as a team, like what is the benefit? So the big one for me, and this is huge as someone who really likes to iterate early, shortening the time to market. So many things out there when it comes to building tools and platforms or whatever, not just for a competitive advantage as well, but for your own kind of, internal direction as a company. You need to get shipped fast. You need to ship and iterate quickly from there with the feedback you can get. The shorter you can, produce that time to market, the earlier you get feedback, the earlier you can get money, the earlier you can retire on a yacht in some random European Riviera or whatever. You get to focus on product and problems, not infrastructure. Now, that is, I think, a huge win that I've mentioned a lot more, but it's worth reiterating, is that you don't have to worry about what your stuff's running on. You just focus on writing the code and solving the problem that you are doing for your customers. Now, shifting costs as far down the line as we can. So this is another crucial thing, especially in this stage where money isn't free anymore. Shifting costs as far to the later stage of a company's life cycle, that's so important for just actually getting out there and validating your idea. I started a company last year, and we did 9 months of running. We couldn't get it off the ground. We built a very, very complex system, but all in all, I think the infrastructure cost I ran away with was £30. And for that huge company experience where we got to see the kind of life cycle stage of everything, we did the customers, we did the sales, we did all of these things, and we had a wonderfully kind of like globally scaled functioning platform, which was so over-engineered. But hey, it was built on serverless technology, so the actual cost in my pocket for this valuable lifetime experience, it was nothing. And if we were successful, if we had made a meal out of it, then sure, we'd be paying that back later on when we, established and had our kind of reliable users and we had the money coming in, and it'd be fine because, that's the nature of business and partnerships. But because serverless tech was structured in such a way to make it easy to start, and, the scale to zero thing that I mentioned before, where, you're only really paying for something when it's in use, it makes it so easy to just try an idea. If it doesn't work, hey, it's time you wasted, but there's so much you've learned. I wouldn't even call it time wasted. It's just time spent doing something that maybe didn't work out, but ultimately you're not left out of pocket. So that's really important. And another thing that's really important to me, a better developer experience. Now, this is something I think is such a crucial thing in this kind of modern age where, you need force multipliers, you need these things where, it's not just your product that's a competitive advantage. It's ultimately the way that you can engineer and build products yourself. So talk a little bit more about developer experience. Now, again, this is something I could do a whole talk about because I think it's very, very exciting. But ultimately, it's a force multiplier for projects. If you've got 5 engineers, 3 engineers, any number of engineers, you need to be able to make the most of that resource. It's far, far easier to make a developer 1.5 times, kind of more productive in their role by giving them good tools than it is to hire kind of 1.5 times more engineers, which, as everyone knows, doesn't necessarily mean in 1.5 times output. It's a lot cheaper as well to be able to dive into kind of the good tooling, the good projects, and understanding kind of what actually is going to result in kind of a good experience. And you can get so much more out of kind of like your team if not only, do they kind of, be able to ship faster is a good thing, but ultimately they're happier as well. It's not just a case of, it's output as a function of their work. It's a case of the fact that, they're happy being able to ship things faster. So they're going to be a happy individual. They're going to have more care about the product they're building. They're going to have more care into the process. I cannot count the number of times where I've seen people inadvertently kind of lose interest in not only a company, but also kind of like the wider mission, just because they got so frustrated at the tool chain and the workload that they were picking up, because it was so kind of hard not to just kind of, build and debug and do all of the kind of standard regular engineering things, but the observability and understanding kind of the actual issues that their customers were having, it's so much harder unless you have a good tool chain. And that's why I focus on the developer experience is so important, because it has such a knock-on effect on the rest of your operation. That there's one kind of crucial thing, which is so early in the development cycle, with a good focus, it really pays its dividends later on. But it also allows you to iterate a lot faster. And that means a shorter time to validation. And that means a better business. So it can't all be good. Now, I said at the start, serverless isn't the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet in the world of tech. I'm very, very happy to admit that, despite the fact that I often claim to my bosses that there are. It is just another layer of vendor locking. When you look at the kind of the modern world of the big kind of cloud giants, you've got GCP, you've got Azure, you've got AWS, of course, lest you forget. And then if you're feeling kind of really interesting, you've got DigitalOcean, you've got Fly.io, amongst many, many others of what you kind of would consider a cloud company. If you're using those platforms, you're going to be kind of locked into them anyway. I have seen one enterprise attempt to do, like firsthand, a cloud migration, and it was an 18-month project which overspent by about £350 million. There is absolutely zero chance that you're going to be able to pull off a good cloud migration without a lot of money. So, you might as well just lean into a bit more vendor lock-in, he says, working for a vendor platform. But, ultimately, it's a business risk. It's an individual risk. That's something you have to calculate yourselves. Cost at scale isn't always easy to predict. Now, when I said earlier that you kind of shift your cost to the right of the kind of company process, that means later on, when you're at scale, you're going to have to work out and deal with the cost of that. The beauty of serverless is that it's very, very easy to scale. Now, being easy to scale means that you can also be hit with a very, very big bill because you've scaled and you didn't quite realize it at that point in time. It is a very, very difficult industry being able to, or not do the interesting role, trying to calculate the exact cost of a single user doing a single action on your site in burst traffic when you've just had a huge social media storm. It's a lot easier to say, I've got 350 servers or nodes in my Kubernetes cluster, which each has this amount of RAM and this amount of CPU. I know that it can handle roughly 100,000 concurrent users, and I know the fixed cost of that month by month. Although kind of burst traffic, obviously the serverless approach is going to be able to handle it, and your Kubernetes cluster could probably handle it as well. You know what the Kubernetes cluster is going to cost every single month because you see the bill, you know exactly what you're paying for. With serverless, you pay for usage, you don't pay for kind of server space. So it's a lot harder to do your cost predictions. You can still do it. I have done it, but it's not fun. So if you don't like doing that, just stick to AWS, it's fine. It's also not a silver bullet for system design. Now, I've seen quite a naive take quite a few times. You're just like, oh, it's fine. We don't have to think about architecture. We're doing it on servers. We're using AWS lambdas. We're using LFI functions. You need to think differently when you're doing stuff in a serverless space, not just for the cost perspective, because again, it's very, very easy to get into kind of some traps when you're, deploying serverless applications. You need just to think differently because of the way they work. When you're looking at, LFI functions, AWS lambdas, there are cold starts because you've scaled to zero, because you've got no usage. There is going to be bits of time where there is absolutely nothing running in AWS of your code, in theory. But when you get a user, when you get that interaction, that needs to spin up a little thing which will run your code and then return a response and shut it down again. That cold start, that isn't suitable for everything. If you've got a data intensive 24/7 in inverted commas operation, you're kind of going to want those quick responses all the time. You may not want to have a 350 millisecond delay as you get back to your user because an action performed. You want to have that instantaneous approach. If you look at banking, if you look at developer tooling, serverless may not actually be a good fit for that. But again, it's understanding not just the problem you're solving, but really most importantly, the way that you're going about it. And I think ultimately, despite having just said not every workload can be serverless, it's a nuanced take. But for 99% of things, it works great. And that's a really, really important thing I want to take away is that, for most problems out there, you have to find a serverless. Sure, there's a huge thing in the kind of tech world right now about AWS Prime Video. AWS Prime Video, that's not a thing. Amazon Prime Video, moving from AWS serverless with their lambdas to the AWS EC2 stuff. Now, that's a valid thing. They saved a huge amount of money with their approach. But I raised two arguments. There's a huge kind of survivorship bias thing. Now, obviously, Amazon Prime isn't a thing that's going to struggle because they chose EC2 over serverless. There's a huge amount of momentum with that, and it's a huge amount of context beyond the technology choices as to why that's a successful product. But ultimately, if you've got something that allows you to ship faster early on without having to worry about all of the kind of infrastructure costs, that's a competitive advantage against kind of your peers if they're doing kind of their Kubernetes cluster, which will scale up, or their EC2 stuff, which will scale up. You need to think about kind of in that moment what's going to allow you to move you a bit quicker. And that ultimately, I think, is what's really, really important early on. That was my first counter argument. There's another one as well. Oh, yes, the other one. Amazon Prime is definitely in the 0.00001% of technological use cases that most people are going to run into in a day-to-day. That is such a huge scale that, again, it makes sense that they're revisiting something that a decision they made early on. And that is the wonderful part of technology, and the wonderful part of working in this role is that you get to see such a kind of the start to finish, the epic, the arc of a technological journey of a company. Migrations and evolutions are a part of that. That is a natural step to take. There is going to be something where they move from EC2 to serverless, from serverless to EC2, and you get to understand and learn from the reasons why. And that's the only thing I can really advise doing, is looking at the experience of the big boys and seeing what's happened there, because that's going to give you a really, really kind of good indicator as to what the kind of general reasons understanding is from the kind of people who've had to go through the problems of that scale. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting problem. But anyway, enough doom and gloom. How do we do the thing? So platforms like Netlify in orange, although we're a green company, I'm doing it in orange, so it's not too branded, offer great tooling for serverless development. You can use languages that you already know. That's the really, really cool thing, is that it's not necessarily a huge paradigm shift. It is just focusing on the code in a way that you're already familiar with. If you're a front-end engineer who's kind of wanting to dive into the backend space, you can use JavaScript, TypeScript to be able to do all the stuff you need to do in backend space. And because it's serverless, you don't have to learn and worry about the complex infrastructure that goes under the hood to power that stuff. There are so many times where I've seen kind of, I'm not going to say naive assumptions, because they're very, very valid assumptions, but back-end engineering can be such a black box of actually what goes on inside, and you just want to focus on building something. It's a lot easier to just pick up something you already know how to use and know that there is a platform engineer somewhere who knows exactly what's going on. But thankfully, they're on call for not just your site, but 100,000 other ones out there, where if anything goes wrong in them, it's going to be fixed pretty quickly. And that's the beauty of it, is that you get the power and the ability to do what all of these companies with huge resource can. You can do that from the get-go. But it's not for everyone. Platforms like ours, you've got Cloudflare, Vercel, all the other ones out there. It's not necessarily for everyone, so you can always use AWS and GCP if you want to. They offer fantastic, serverless offerings. Huge fan of GCP Cloud Run, Google Cloud Platform Cloud Run. Great offering, and it's that sweet spot of finding kind of what's the best about serverless, which was the cost aspect for me, but also the flexibility of the technology I already knew, which was the container-based kind of backend services and that microservice architecture. And that, I think, is a beauty, is that there's this core shared mentality and appreciation to move in a direction where you are thinking more about kind of the code, and then you're just given the freedom to really just do what you want on top of that. So yeah, I'm really getting philosophical about serverless, and I didn't expect that, but hey, things happen. So anyway, this application, blimey, this talk did have building in the title. So let's build. This is the wonderful little diagram from one of the early slides on this presentation. We've got a full stack application here. We've got front end and back end. Now, imagine any kind of known architecture you worked in. If you haven't had the pleasure, think complex things, please. It makes my job easier. This is kind of what this is going to look like in a serverless environment, specifically a Netlify one. Shush, don't tell anyone. You've got your Netlify functions, which have distinct, clear responsibilities. You've got your front-end application, which has its own kind of framework, its own dependencies, its own complexities. You've got it all within kind of this one repository, this one project folder, and it's co-located. It's so simple to be able to do all the things which kind of you need to do. So your APIs and application can co-locate. I've known a huge amount of kind of problems where you are trying to share types, you're trying to share information between your front end and back end application. Now, there's a lot of kind of theories and arguments as to what you should and shouldn't do, but ultimately, if you're just focusing on shipping something, you just want to be able to do stuff easy. because you have such a good kind of tooling infrastructure when you use kind of a serverless platform, it's very, very easy for just let them kind of handle the complex things. You don't have to worry about necessarily like, oh, is this going to pick this up? Is this going to, find all the dependencies that we've added, but we haven't added it for this one? Or, all of these different kind of problems that you're going to have when you're managing kind of a complex back-end and front-end architecture living in a hybrid location. But it's a problem that's already been solved for 20 million other kind of sites and platforms out there. You can just leverage that developer experience and make the tooling responsible for the deployment. It's that ability, focusing on the abstraction stuff I mentioned earlier, it's making it someone else's problem. And we've just, going from cloud to serverless is exactly the same from going from dedicated, servers in your own space to moving to a kind of cloud-based environment. It's that level of just making it someone else's problem. This is just kind of the latest iteration. I hesitate to say latest, but it is one of the more recent iterations, shall we say, in that kind of direction of making things someone else's problem. And I really, really do enjoy doing that. And there's a really, really kind of good, I couldn't find the reference to it. There's a fantastic quote I saw, which was along the lines of, the ideal serverless environment is when all infrastructure is self-provisioned and you don't have to worry about it. And just from this kind of like folder structure, you have your backend with all of the kind of serverless functions you need to be able to do things. You have your front end deployed and the global capability of kind of a platform's network. You have all of that infrastructure kind of self-provisioned. You haven't done anything. All you've done is you've chosen a platform, you've chosen your front end framework, and you've just written some code on the back end. It's that simple. You don't have to worry about anything. And that, I think, is the beauty of this kind of later stage, is that you don't have to do anything and it's all there. And I think that's a really, really cool process. But it's not just all about building and not all about running on the cloud. It's also a lot about doing stuff on your machine and testing it and running it locally. So because serverless, again, I've said that word a lot, funny that, because it is an abstraction over infrastructure and you're focused on the code, why can't we just bring an abstraction that runs on your local machine that acts as if it was running in the cloud? You don't have to worry about the fact that, sure, it's going to be like, when this is deployed, there's going to be S3 buckets in AWS, there's going to be AWS Lambdas doing all of that. You can emulate that really, really nicely locally with a good CLI. And you are given kind of the full capability of your production environment, but locally. And I think that is a huge kind of win when it comes to just a good developer experience. When it comes to building the, kind of big complex apps that, you do when you work at startups, it's a lot of fun. Running that environment is always a pain. I've never had a good time in any kind of microservice or Kubernetes driven environment. There are wonderful tools out there built by people a lot smarter than I am. And I still haven't had a good time with it. And that's probably my own ineptitude, but it is, I think, a wider thing of when you're in these complex environments is that they are difficult to replicate. They are very, very hard to get up and running. But because with serverless, again, you've made it someone else's problem, they've built the tooling to support this, you don't have to worry about building your own solution for that local environment because it's already there. You've already got that system which replicates kind of your local your local, production network functions or serverless functions or whatever. That's all done, solved, and someone else's problem. And because, and we'll get onto this later, talking more about kind of when it's up and running in a cloud or a given cloud, because it is just your code. It's very, very easy for that to just be replicated across lots of times. So you can have many, many copies of this. And there is a very, very good, useful use of that. But we'll come into that. Hot reloading. Now, that I think is such a cool thing. It's not just, unique to serverless. I've seen it in game development. I've seen it everywhere. But it is, again, one of those things that you have when you can control the tool chain all the way down to kind of your developer's, local machine. You have the ability to just specify good techniques and make it really, really easy to use that. It's a problem that's already been solved. And this is all because you're building the serverless practices. It is the idea that you have just written your code and you get to use the tooling that another kind of company has gone out there and built. So you've done all the local stuff, but you need to run it. Looking at our Rainforest Web Services Lambda, what could that possibly be? Serverless costs on usage, not on idle. So this is that scaling to zero concept that I've mentioned quite a few times. The ability of that is you get to leverage the global regions offered by a provider. So, when you look at AWS, they have presence in almost every feasible place on the planet. And with that, you get to be able to run your code in that environment and get it running in all of the places. It's a case of, as well, with the abstractions on top of that, you don't have to worry about the fact that it's historical work. I probably should have done this a bit better, but if we go back, you've got your Lambda function, which is just your code running somewhere. Because space is cheap, it is so easy, and by space I mean kind of like hard drive storage or SSD storage or whatever. It is so easy to just keep all historical copies of the code that you've done, and you just point at the one that you want to run at that point in time, and you're only paying for the actual requests that are being used. You're only paying for something that is actually doing stuff. You don't have to worry about kind of that idle time, that zero time, and that means we don't have to worry about kind of all of the billions of things we've done in the past. We can just keep them there, and we can instantly access and roll back and push back to stuff that's already going on. And it's great for collaborating as well, because every single thing that you do, because of that scaling to zero kind of core concept, you can have the full isolated environment that you've worked in at that point. It's a very atomic snapshot, essentially, at that point in time, that can be kept forever, and that can run forever, and that can do things forever at next to no cost. And that historical context, being able to look at an application at a fixed point in time and understand what's going on, that's fantastic. But also just for issues, not everything goes perfectly, no matter what CI/CD you've got. You can have the best test in the world and still things get through. The ability to instantly say, wait, let's just roll back without having to kind of redeploy or do any kind of, git reverts or whatever. That is possible because you're working in that serverless environment where you can keep all of that work. So it's very hard to differentiate what is the nuance of platform-specific things and what is ultimately a serverless core concept. But the serverless idea offers and enables the platform-specific stuff. So overall, we built the thing. Go team, go us, wonderful. We built our fantastic idea, whatever that was, and we've done it on serverless because we're fun, we're trendy. What should we take away? The most important thing is serverless does use servers. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They're very cheeky for trying to, but you don't have to worry about it. It is just a simple fact of life that some things have to run on servers, including serverless stuff. But hey, it's just one of those things. Developer experience is crucial in modern products. And this I can't highlight enough. There are so many things that an early company needs to focus on. But from an engineering perspective, developer experience is probably the day one concern for me. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to build a product quickly enough, and your competitors are going to beat you. Now, I don't mean to scaremonger, but yeah, it's, again, part of my convincing tactics. Serverless just lets you focus on your product. And that, I think, is what's so fantastic for me, is I consider myself a product engineer, not a software engineer, because I build products that just happens to be done with software. And this means that I can spend more time coding, more time building, more time talking to customers, and more time doing presentations at midnight in the UK. But hey, you know what? It's all part of the fun. So no, thank you so much for listening to my rambles. That is, fortunately for you, the end. I am happy to take any and all questions if you have any. If you don't, that's because I've done such a good job. And hey, that's definitely not the case. But anyway, things happen.
Sarah.
Hey, John. Thank you so much for the presentation, Edward. It was really enjoyable, particularly at the end, which made me chuckle. So I have a question about, for Netlify being the team that is doing the part that our developer team doesn't want to do. So you're providing that that expertise and that service that we're depending on. What does your product development process look like? How do you keep up with all of the versioning of the libraries and the services that you make available to your customers?
No, it's a really good point, because it's very easy to preach these practices, but unless you're kind of doing it yourself, you don't really understand them. So I really appreciate that. I think for us, it's dog fooding where we can, and dog fooding being a process of using your own product to well, not just as a kind of like customer, but also as well professionally. If you can use your own product to do your products, if that makes sense, you're in a really good place. We're very fortunate that we're able to do that. So we're able to use kind of Netlify as a platform to build my team, the integration side of things, to build all of our work. But when it comes to that, I guess kind of more supply chain side of things, the core underpinnings, that supply chain security side is really interesting. So This is probably this is definitely the largest scale company I've ever worked at, not just in terms of kind of sheer scale and outreach, but I think just in pure kind of footprint on the technological environment. It's both a very, very exciting place, but more importantly, it's a very, very humbling experience, because when it comes to kind of like the smallest thing that kind of comes in, that it could affect negatively or positively a huge amount of people and companies and livelihoods and whatever. So although that's a very, very dramatic view on what we do, it ultimately is really, really important that we need to just be aware of what's going on. So without giving too much of the secret magic away, it's keeping a pulse on everything, but knowing when to execute on kind of good direction. So that for me is frankly intuition, and I have no idea how I've been able to do it successfully for a year so far, but hey, I can't complain. But it's also, it's taking the time and consideration to understand where you are in that product lifecycle. So, I'm a huge fan of doing things that don't scale as a concept. I had that on a Y Combinator startup podcast, and it's burned in my brain. I use it as my excuse for everything. But you can only do that early on, especially because we are at scale as a company. We can only do that so long in our product development lifecycle. And it's having that kind of good kind of respect of like, okay, this is internal, this is kind of beta testing, this is alpha testing. No, the other way, sorry. This is internal, alpha, beta, then public. We change how hacky we are, frankly, the further right we go along that process. And we have a very, very fantastic kind of security and site readiness team who, site reliability, team who kind of not kind of keep on top of us, but pushes in the right direction to ensure that we are doing things properly as soon as it hits kind of a public market. And so that all ties together in the fact that we have a huge capability to experiment very, very quickly, but also we have confidence in what we deliver isn't going to be negatively impactful. I realize I answered two questions in two very, very different ways then, so I hope there is an answer you're happy with amongst that. If not, I can try again. But I'll stop.
No, I thought that was great. I'll build on the question though, not having seen the experience of using the product. Do developers see something in the interface where they can see, for example, what is the latest version of Next.js? Is the version they want to use available in Netlify? Should they wait a little bit? It's coming soon. How did they see what is available to them?
It's really, really good, and it's something we're as a team for our work in the integration side of things really trying to explore, is that whole kind of organic discovery. And
right.
You can't make that too artificial because then it's not organic, but you understand what I'm trying to mean.
Mm-hmm.
For kind of the framework side for the Next.js stuff, we've got a huge, well, it's not huge, but we have a fantastic team who really understand the underpinnings of all of that stuff and what goes on, but also understand what we need to do to be able to support stuff. And we've got a couple of people who are very, very, I mean, if for sales listening, I need to shut up, but we monitor their GitHub, all of the kind of notifications that go to the Next.js repository. It's very, very easy for us to be able to kind of keep an eye on the direction of where things could be going. And so with that, it's a case of, balancing what is worth investing our time in to be able to build and scale out, and then also from that communicating that in a way which is digestible. So we've got a great developer relations team, Phil, who spoke just before me. He's on that team. They do a really, really good job of communicating essentially what we've been up to. I mean, there's a few times where we've been able to essentially jump the gun and release some things for Next.js which our competitors or other providers haven't necessarily got around to just yet. It's it's a very, very hard game, not kind of flashing things in your user's face and forcing them to always use the latest version or whatever. Especially kind of big enterprises has such a kind of deliberately and considered approach to every single software release that they use. But ultimately for our smaller teams and customers, it's all about making available kind of the latest stuff and ensuring that they can use it. So it's a wonderful combination of the frameworks team being able to kind of support and engineer whatever we need to do with the frameworks, but then as well the developer relations team and internal engineering being able to kind of promote the work that we're doing and promote the functionality through the docs, through blog posts and social media stuff. So through the interface specifically, there's not a way to say, hey, by the way, there's a new Next.js version, but there's a lot of kind of other blasts that are available that people can see what's happened. Again, a very roundabout answer to a very precise question, so I can only apologize.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, we have a couple minutes left. Any other questions from people that are on Zoom? All right. Ed, we recognize that it's very late for you, and we really appreciate your contributions to our camp here at Stanford. Appreciate it.
Huge pleasure. I'm going to go jump into bed and have a great night's sleep. But honestly, no, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Yeah, really, really enjoyable. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, please do in any form of communication. My surname is very unique, so I'm not hard to find. But yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Enjoy
Thank
your
you.
rest. Thanks.